Uh, so, if I could get the slideshow working. So one thing I'd like you to think about throughout what I'm talking about is what has a three-legged stool got to do with ringing. I will come back to that later, and we'll look at a little bit of that towards the end of the sort of 30 minutes or so that I'm going to talk through. Uh, but really, this session comes down to what is good striking. Um, so what we're aiming for with, and that leads into understanding why blindly following ropes isn't reliable for getting a decent sound of bells. So what we're looking for with good striking is we're looking for very even spacing of bells, and that is the bell sound and not the ropes. And it helps when you're in the tower. I mean, of course, this isn't going to apply to handbells or if you're ringing on ringing room, but for in the tower, it does help to understand the point of the bell swing where the bell sounds. So hopefully all of you have been in a tower and rung a bell. Of course, that's a little bit of an assumption at the moment, because I understand that we do have some new ringers coming into ringing since we stopped ringing, and so there are people who have rung on ringing room but have never actually handled a bell. So the point at which a bell swings, hopefully you're all fully aware that it swings towards, that you pull the bell swings, and then the sound comes towards the end of the swing. So there's a significant delay between you starting your pull and the bell striking or sounding. And you're all aware, I hope, that that delay is not the same on every bell. So there's a number of factors that affect how long there is between the pull and the sound. And there's things such as weight, the shape of the bell, which is actually largely down to the age of the bell. So some much older bells are what we call much longer waisted, so they're sort of tall and thin rather than the modern shape. That affects where the center of gravity is, which affects how quickly the bell swings. And then things such as position of the garter hole, so the point at which the rope goes through the wheel can affect how long that delay is. Quality of bearings will affect how quickly the bell swings. And then whether or not you've got a counterbalanced headstock, so whether the center of the bell, center of gravity of the bell is pulled towards the middle of the swing by having an oxbow shaped headstock that pulls the bell up towards the middle. So all of those affect how quickly a bell swings. So what we also have is, so I said about the large and small bells, but at this point it's just worth looking at the arrows on here. So the points of the arrow tips on each of these diagrams shows roughly the point at which the bell is going to sound. And that's after the bell has swung through nearly a full circle. So you pull the bell, it swings almost a full circle, and it strikes just towards the end of that. So looking at the larger and smaller bells here, you'll see that for the small bell compared with the larger bell, the length of that arrow going around the outside of the wheel is smaller. So actually what we've got is the distance that the mouth of the bell travels will be greater for a larger bell than for a smaller bell. And that's one of the many factors that's going to affect how a bell swings, how it sounds, and what the delay is between the pull and the sound. So larger bells take a lot longer to swing through that full circle for a number of reasons. So center of gravity, so effectively where the middle of the weight of the bell is further from the pivot point in a larger bell. So that will make it swing slower. It's quite simply heavier, and you get the weight distribution that moves the center of gravity. The outside of the bell's got a lot further to travel. And typically you'll find the time for a swinging bell will be, for most bells, between about 1.5 and 3 seconds. And obviously, if you go and ring a much heavier bell, so the tenor at Liverpool Cathedral, it gets even longer than that. So you've got to constantly predict how long you need to allow between pulling the rope and the bell sounding. And there's another factor as well. So whilst I've been talking about the swing of the bells, of course, you've got clappers as well, and those have to swing across the bell. So larger clappers will take longer to swing a full circle than a smaller clapper. And there are some techniques that are used to adjust that, such as a wooden clapper shaft on very heavy bells, and that just that just reduces the length of time that it takes the clapper to swing across the bell. Roger, Fiona Sayers seems to be having trouble getting into the meeting.
Yeah, actually, I've been asked to miss her again. That's fine.
Yeah, okay. So what does this mean for the striking? Well, what we're looking for is spacing the bells evenly. And as I said earlier, what that means is spacing out the sound of the bells, not spacing out the pull on the ropes. So we've got to use our ears to judge that. So what we need to understand for any set of bells is, we need to know what the various delays are between pulling the bell and swinging it, and that's a lot of what we'll be talking about, just to ensure that that interval between bells sounding is correct. So for the timing of the bell, if we look at two bells of similar weight, so maybe one bell following another in the tower, what we're looking for is the bell sounding where we've got the two lines to the right of this slide, and that's the gap between the bells that we're looking for. So what we've got to do is judge where we pull, so that we get a similar interval. So two adjacent bells, the interval between the pull will be about the same as the interval that we want between striking. So if you think of all of these types of diagrams, we've got time running from left to right, and so what we've got here, apart from the pulling sound, we've got two bells with I don't know whether you can see my pointer, but the gap between the two bells is roughly the same as the gap between the two sounds. And that's what we're aiming for every time. If we've got a large bell followed by a small bell, well, we know that a large bell takes longer to swing than a small bell. So a large bell followed by a small bell, we will then have to adjust our pull so that we seem to leave a bigger gap between pulling to get the same sort of sound. And that's because the smaller bell has a shorter interval between the pull and strike. So larger gap between the ropes, and that looks a bit like this. And I apologize for the sound. I don't know whether you can even hear the sound, but it's coming out here, and it's pretty awful. So let's just look at that again. So between pulling the ropes, we've got a large bell followed by a small bell. A big gap between the ropes gives us a small gap between the sound. And then if we look at that the other way round, small bell followed by a large bell, then what you've got is the large bell's got a longer interval between the pull and the sound. And that means we need to make the gap between the pulls a lot smaller to get the interval of the bell sounding. Okay. In extreme circumstances where you've got a large bell followed by a small bell, you may actually need to pull the larger bell before the smaller bell. And that's what we're going to see here. So I'll go back and show that again. So the larger bell pulls first, smaller bell pulls afterwards, but they sound the other way around. So if you're ringing on a very heavy set of bells and you've got a tenor following a treble, then you see that effect. I think the most extreme example of that I've seen was Dalton in Furness up in the South Lake District. It's 20 hundredweight 10, so it's not particularly heavy. And even on those bells, the tenor would need to pull earlier than the front four bells to sound after them. It really is quite an extreme effect on a not particularly heavy set of bells. So every set of bells has its own peculiarities. So you constantly need to take into account whether you're ringing a heavy bell, a light bell, a middle bell. I see some faces on here who will know that I will always gravitate towards the middle of the chain, the middle of the circle if I can, so I don't need to worry about it quite so much. So I take the easy way out sometimes. So, but in addition to knowing whether you're ringing a heavy bell or a light bell and how that affects where you pull, you get the additional complication that not all bells, in fact very few bells, are perfectly struck. And so we run into what we call odd struck bells. So normally what we will see, what we would hope to see with a perfect bell, is that the interval between pulling at hand stroke and the bell sounding at hand stroke is exactly the same as between pulling at backstroke and the interval sounding at backstroke. So the point in the swing at which the bell sounds, at both hand stroke and backstroke, is the same. As shown on this diagram. However, that's rarely the case. And sometimes you'll find, or quite often you'll find, that the clapper is slightly out of line with the center of the bell. And that can affect how the bell sounds. And there's numerous factors that will affect whether a bell is odd struck or not. But a clapper being out of line with the center of the bell is one of them. And Southampton St Mary's, when I learned to ring there, getting on for 40 years ago, the clapper on the 9th was about 1/8 of an inch out of line, so very slightly out of line. And it made it incredibly odd struck. So it struck more quickly at one stroke than the other. So having the clapper out of line will change the delay between the pull and the strike on each stroke. And then what it will do is it will quicken it to one stroke and slow it down at the other stroke. So if we look at correct clappering, we've got an interval between, and I think the best way to look at it is between the bottom of the swing and where the bell sounds. So the length of the arrow round the outside is what we're actually looking for. An odd struck bell with the clapper slightly out of line, what you will then find is that the clapper has to swing slightly further round before it hits the bell. So that means that we would call that bell slow struck at hand stroke, slow at hand stroke. So the effect of that is that you will need to adjust your pull to allow for the odd struckness. So if you find the bell's a bit slow at hand stroke, you'll need to pull slightly sooner on the hand stroke to get it to sound in the right place. When we look at the other stroke for the same bell, you'll find that a bell that's odd struck one way will also generally be odd struck the other way. So in this particular case, we see a bell where when you pull a backstroke, the interval between it being at the bottom of the swing and it sounding is a little bit less than you would expect. So we would say that bell is quick at backstroke. So what you need to do with a bell that's ringing quickly at backstroke is you just need to slightly delay your pull to allow for that quickness. And by that delay, I mean, that is fractions of a second. You measure it in terms of milliseconds more than, I'd say. And when Roger gets onto the bit he's doing later, you'll start to find that you can actually hear errors of about 30 to 40 milliseconds. So 30 to 40 thousandths of a second. So I think you'll be quite surprised when you come onto that bit of the morning session, just how accurate your ears are at listening to gaps between bells. So here we see both strokes together. So hand stroke, we've got a bell that's ringing slowly at hand stroke, so it strikes late at hand stroke, and it strikes quickly at backstroke. So if you're ringing an odd struck bell and you just follow the ropes, then what you'll find is that you'll ring too close at one stroke and too far away at the other stroke. And so that will mean that the ringing will sound a little bit rough, a little bit uneven. And you as a ringer will start to spot that as you get more experienced. And people outside the tower will also start to notice that the ringing isn't quite as even as it should be. So, but when it's not only the bell itself that's affected, or the ringer who's ringing the odd struck bell that's affected. Whoever is following that bell will also need to adjust the gaps between their pull. So the ringer following will actually need to ring at a steady ringing speed, but they will start to notice that the gap between following the rope in front of them at one stroke and the other is smaller at one stroke than the other. So if you're ringing an odd struck bell, you need to compensate for your pull. If you are following an odd struck bell and you are ringing by following the ropes, then you will also need to adjust your, how quickly you pull compared with that other bell. Although actually what you're not doing, what you're doing is ringing at a steady speed yourself. So it's actually the ringers who need to compensate. I have been asked at this point why we don't just sort out the odd struck bells, get rid of the odd struckness. Actually, it's quite difficult. There are some modern bells that have got what are called twiddle pins on clappers, so you can adjust odd struckness. But older bells don't necessarily have that, and sorting out odd struckness on bells can actually be quite difficult to do. So as a ringer, assume that you need to compensate. So if we look at, we're going to look here at 3 adjacent bells for the timing of the pull, and we're looking at an example where the second bell, and this isn't in the picture at the moment, is quick at hand stroke and slow at backstroke, and how the ringer needs to compensate. So with a bell that's quick at hand stroke, we need to have a bigger gap between pulling compared with the bell in front. So the odd struck bell, the one, again, apologies for the sound. Let's look at that again. The odd struck bell, the black and white Sally in the middle, is going to leave a bigger gap. Then the bell that's ringing third seems to close up the gap, but you get the even spacing of the bells at the end. If we then look at the backstroke for the same thing, what you'll then find is that the odd struck bell will need to ring closer to the bell that it's following. So what we see between the first and second bell is a bigger gap at hand stroke and a smaller gap at backstroke. The bell that's ringing third, the ropes seem to be closer at hand stroke than at backstroke. But if you consider the gap between the first and third bells, it's the same in each case. So it's the odd struck bell ringer that needs to adjust the speed of their pull, and that is actually adjusting how quickly they pull at hand stroke and backstroke. The ringer that's following the odd struck bell needs to ring at a steady speed, but it seems to be that they're ringing closer at hand stroke and backstroke, but the spacing of the sound of the bells comes out even. Hopefully that's clear enough to you. There's time for questions at the end if you want to come back to that. So remember that bells can be odd struck either way, so they could be quick at hand stroke or they could be quick at backstroke. And generally, where they're quick at one stroke, they will be correspondingly slow at the other stroke. As I said earlier, it's difficult to resolve by modifying the bell, so it's the ringer who needs to compensate. And significantly, you need to take a different action at each stroke. So you'll need to ring quicker at one stroke. If you ring quicker at one stroke, you need to ring a bit slower at the other stroke. And never assume that a bell is not odd struck. Sometimes you go into towers and the locals, towers you're not familiar with, and the locals will tell you that a bell is odd struck. Sometimes they'll just assume that you'll work it out for yourself. But what you need to do when you take a bell and you're ringing in rounds before you go into a piece of chain ringing or into chord changes, start to use those rounds to work out whether your bell is odd struck or not. how quickly, how much you need to adjust and in which way you need to adjust. So when you listen to experienced bands who are starting a piece of ringing, more often than not, what you will find is they'll spend quite a lot of time in rounds before they go into any changes. And that is because what they're doing is just trying to work out the obstructness of their bells, how they need to ring them, and the conductor will be giving them time before they start to go into a performance piece. So adjusting the timing of the pull. So as I said, what we're looking for is the correct striking, even gaps between strokes, between the sounds. So if you've got an odd struck bell that's slow at hand stroke, sorry, quick at hand stroke, then to get the bell to ring in the right place, you'll actually need, so for an even struck bell, in the top diagram, the length of pull, the length of gap between the hand stroke and the sound and the backstroke and the sound is the same. Where the bell is odd struck and quick at hand stroke, then you need to compensate by moving that interval between pulls, so just slowing it down a bit. So the odd struckness makes the bell quick at hand stroke. You need to just delay your pull so that you get the bell in the right place. So just the interval of the pull. For an odd struck bell, quick at hand stroke, so the bell will sound a little bit earlier. Slow at backstroke, so you just need to have a slightly longer delay at that point. So if it's quick at hand stroke, you need a slower hand stroke, leave a slightly bigger gap. If you have the same pull, same interval between your hand strokes, backstroke, so the blue box in the middle, you'll strike late. So what you need to do is just speed up the hand stroke, slow down, slow down the hand stroke, speed up the backstroke, and you'll find that the sounds come in the right place. So, having convinced you now that just following ropes doesn't work, the question then is, what does work instead? So, don't get me wrong, looking at ropes has its place, and in change ringing, it's always worth looking at ropes because you start to see how your blue line interacts with other blue lines. You start to see who your coarse bell is after bell, how you work with them. But it's not 100% reliable for striking. So what we need is additional assistance to strike our bell in the correct place. So perfect striking, I try to think of each change as a series of boxes. What we've actually got here is 2 rows on 6 bells. So a series of, I think of it as a series of boxes, a series of time intervals. And what I'm aiming to do is to place the sound of my bell right in the middle of each time interval. So that pull has to place that cross right in the middle of that. And the reason there's a shaded bit in the middle, of course, we all ring with a hand stroke gap, don't we? Or we should, unless we're in sort of Devon or in, I think it's Wakefield, where they also ring with a closed hand stroke. So there's a couple of parts of the country they ring with closed hand stroke, but generally, wherever you ring in the country or in the world, if you go to places like Australia and New Zealand, you'll find there's a hand stroke gap. So regardless of whether the person you're following is in the middle of their sort of time box or not, you should be aiming to put your bell right in the middle of your gap. Easier said than done. So aids to good striking. So what techniques can we use to make sure that we strike properly? So we've already talked about looking, and as I said, looking has its place. It will get you roughly into the right place most of the time, but it's not 100% reliable. So now we need to think of other techniques as well. So you need to listen to where your bell strikes. So every time you pull, you need to listen to the effect and where your bell strikes compared with the ones adjacent to it. And if it's not in the middle of that gap, then you need to adjust. Or you need to understand that you're in the right place and the bell that you're following or the one that's following you is wrong. So you need to listen and you need to work out whether your bell is striking in the right place. And that then brings us on to the third aid to good striking, which is rhythm. So you need to be thinking of the rhythm of the ringing, listening to that rhythm, almost tapping it out as you go, listening to where your bell strikes, and then adjusting where it should sound according to whether it's right on the mark in that rhythm. And that then comes back to our three stools, our three-legged stool. So if you think about a three-legged stool, whatever surface you put it on, with three legs, it is going to be absolutely solid, absolutely steady. So three legs are great. They sort of, you can always get it stable. If you take any one of the legs away from the stool and try to sit on it, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So you're trying to balance on two legs. If you take two of those legs away and you're trying to balance on a stool with one leg, so unless you're an old style milking maid, then you'll probably find it very difficult. And it's the same with striking, with aids to good striking. If you just rely on one of the techniques, your striking is likely to be it's very likely to be uneven. It improves when you use two of them, but if you can use all three, then you're likely to get to a place where your striking is very good. So let's look at look in detail at a couple of these bits. So rhythm is the thing that I think is really important, and ringers don't recognize they've got it. If you think back to your very early days of ringing, if you can think back that far, you were taught to handle a bell, and then you moved into ringing with other people. So you moved on to ringing rounds. And nearly always your teacher will have said to you when you're ringing rounds, look at the bell to your right. So I had to think about that as well since I've rung. Look at the bell to your right and pull just after they pull. And then almost as soon as you start to pull, you'll find your teacher will say, no, you've got to ring closer, closer, closer. And you very quickly realize that actually just following that bell it doesn't really work. You're a bit late. And what you find within a couple of minutes is that a new learner will start to predict when to pull. Now, that predicting when to pull is based on an internal rhythm. And right from your very first time handling a bell and ringing with other people, you will have started predicting when you need to pull to get the bell in the right place. So the first time you rang, you'll find your teacher would have been telling you when to pull sooner. And as soon as you start to listen to them and pull sooner, you find that you're not following the bell in front of you. You're actually ringing a little bit before that. So as you get better, you find you sort of start to feel when you need to pull, and you start, as you get more experienced, you start to feel whether to ring quickly, slowly, or steadily. And you've got those three speeds of ringing in chain ringing. So you've got the steady speed when you're ringing around, you've got a slow speed when you're hunting up to the back, and you've got a quick speed if you're hunting down to lead. So you do get to feel the speeds of ringing. But when you're when you're trying to develop your rhythm, try to count when every bell strikes, not just your own bell. And it does help to emphasize in the ringing when your bell strikes. So if you're ringing the third, and you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then that helps. But if you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and just emphasize where your own bell is, or where your own bell should be, it helps you to pick that bell out amongst the other bells. you develop a rhythm when you're ringing, but be prepared to adapt that rhythm if the overall speed of the ringing changes. Those of you who've rung peals, and I can see there's a few people here who have done, what you'll find is that peal ringing tends to start off fairly steadily in the first hour, and in my experience, the last third of the peal tends to be about a minute quicker than the first. Not always, but generally you'll find that as the ring settles down to a steady rhythm, the speed can increase slightly. Not very much, but a little bit. So be prepared to adapt your rhythm if the overall speed changes. And remember, because of obstructness of bells, you may have a slightly different rhythm for your pull on hand stroke and backstroke. And in fact, the overall change ringing may have a slightly different rhythm for hand stroke and backstroke. So you'll find some bands will ring the hand strokes a little bit quicker than the backstrokes, or vice versa. And particularly if you've got cartwheel ringing with no hand stroke gap, you do find that one stroke is just stretched out slightly more than the other. Okay. So listening then, so second pillar, listening. This is really used to correct the striking. So you use the rhythm to aim for where you want to strike the bell. You then listen to where your bell strikes, and you use that to correct whether your bell is striking in the right place. And this is looking in the middle of your time gap instead of at one end or the other. If you're listening to your bell, well, hopefully you are listening to your bell, remember to correct for errors at the next similar stroke. So if you're a bit quick at hand stroke, correct it at the next hand stroke. If you're a bit slow at backstroke, correct it at the next backstroke. Because if it's down to the bell or you as a ringer and the speed you're ringing a particular stroke, ringing slowly at hand stroke and then correcting it at backstroke doesn't really achieve the overall aim that you're looking for. So correct at the next similar stroke. You must count when you're listening. So you need to count where your bell sounds. So you're counting where you pull, and you're counting the bells as they strike, so you know which is your bell in amongst all the others. And this takes a lot of practice. And at the moment, unfortunately, we can't go into towers and practice this. So do make use of things like listening CDs. There's a very good CD available from the Central Council. You can still get it in lockdown. Able will, if you've got Able, that will also help you by allowing you to put errors into striking, so you can listen to how errors particularly sound. And that's the sort of thing that Roger's going to do with you a bit later. And just remember, it can be difficult to recognize whether it's you or somebody else who has caused an error. And I'm sure that when you start listening to Roger's exercises later, there are going to be times when there's an error and you can't tell which of bells it is. You know roughly in the change where the error is coming, but sometimes it can be difficult to pick out exactly which bell it is, particularly if it's treble or tenor who are making the errors. But coming full circle back to looking and Ropesight, don't forget about looking. An awful lot of the full day's listening skills course we do is aimed purely at developing rhythm and listening. And on the full day course, we do an awful lot of taking your vision away so you can't follow ropes. But as I said earlier, following the ropes is important. With experienced bands, you will see ringers who just seem to be looking at the floor, not actually following bells, not actually looking at the other ropes. What they're actually doing by apparently staring at the floor or looking at the feet of the person opposite them, they're actually using their peripheral vision. And you will find that as soon as you look at one rope that you're following and focus on that rope, then you start to lose sight of the ropes each side. If you just lower your gaze slightly down to people's feet Then what you'll find is that you see more ropes through peripheral vision. So you actually see a lot more by almost having a wide vision rather than focusing on a single rope. Looking is useful. It helps you to determine what other bells are doing, and it helps you to work out where you are in the change. And actually, sometimes looking at people's faces will help you to work out what you're doing in the method, because you catch somebody's eye and they'll give you a nod as to which way you should be going and what you're doing. So don't avoid looking at people's faces. Actually, looking at people's eyes is really useful, but you need to almost switch between looking at people's faces to get hints from them, and then just lowering your gaze so you can see all the other ropes together. And then a quick word on Ropesight. If you want to fully understand Ropesight, Mike Winterbourne can give an absolutely fantastic talk for about 3/4 of an hour on Ropesight. But to summarize the key points from that, Ropesight is being able to see what's happening around you. It is absolutely useless if you're not already ringing in the right place. Ropesight will help you if you're in the right slot, the right gap in the ringing. Ropesight will not get you to the right gap. So that brings us on to questions. So there you go, Roger, 20 minutes instead of 30.
Right, can we stop your screen sharing? I think I've allowed people to unmute themselves if they've got any questions. The talk, obviously what I've got prepared is, or what you've just done reinforces a lot what I'm going to cover in a couple of minutes. So if anybody's got any questions, do unmute themselves. Otherwise, I'll move on and share my screen. I hope that you'll be able to hear my sound. Otherwise, I'll be pulling my hair out in a minute.
That's what I was just going to say, Roger. I'm not sure. I couldn't hear Andy's slides making any noise. There is a function to share sound, I think. You can find it.
Judy, I have to say you are lucky that you didn't hear it, because the sound is not very good. And I did look at how I could get rid of that before I started.
Yeah, we had a little quick go yesterday, but we didn't try sharing sound. I panicked a bit and looked up on my smartphone how to do it. So hopefully I've got that correct.
I didn't want to share the sound.
Okay.
All right, I'll move on and do my bit. So if you bear with me for a few seconds while
Roger, before you do that, I do have some questions.
Fire away.
For Andy. In fact, there's three sort of related questions, Andy. The first is, when you're ringing rounds and you find you're too close to the previous bell, is there any way for you to know whether it's you that's quick or him that's slow? So that's the first question. The second one is, if you're following an odd struck bell in the rounds, you may be able to work that out. But what about all the other ringers in the tower? How do they know that bell is early or late, so that when they ring a method and they're following it, they know whether to ring early or late? And the third one, and this is the horrible one in my mind, is if you've got more than one odd struck bell in the ring, how the hell does that get sorted out? In other words, how does somebody who's late on hand stroke cope with somebody else that's perhaps 2 or 3 bells away from them in the ring? So those are the three questions. Just summing it under, is it you or is it the one you're following? And what happens about other bells when they're ringing a method who haven't had the opportunity to follow that bell in the rounds? And the third one is, if you're on an odd struck bell and there's another odd struck bell in there. So sorry about that. That's it.
Well, okay, let me see if I can remember all those as we go through. So how do you work out whether it's you or somebody else, you or the bell you're following? That's where it comes down to counting as the bells sound and then adjusting your pull to get your bell to sound in the right place. Now, when if you find you have to adjust your pull, so what you're doing is you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you're looking, and you count that evenly, and you're looking for your bell to sound at the point you're counting that number, and you need to count evenly. That's quite difficult. If the bells are so a little bit lumpy, it's very easy to default to counting as those bells strike rather than counting an ideal rhythm. Now, what you'll see is experienced ringers, some experienced ringers will use techniques that I think a lot of the time they don't realize they're doing to count evenly. So there's a guy called Neil Donovan, and Neil won't mind me mentioning this because he's fully aware of how people think of him. Neil will nod his head as he's ringing. So you sort of watch him and you see his head going up and down. And he's known as Noddy up in the, he rings up in Yorkshire. He's known as Noddy because he consciously nods so much as he's ringing. And his nodding is to help him get that rhythm. And if you get into a peel with him and he's, ringing's going really well, the nodding gets even more. There's a guy called Peter Bellamy Knights up in Manchester, and he sort of pretty well jumps up and down as he's ringing. And he's known as Boogie Nights in Manchester because he dances around so much to keep the rhythm. Other ringers, you'll see their mouths going as they count. So if you watch really experienced ringers, you'll see these little peculiarities. And what they're doing is they are counting to a rhythm, and they're then listening to whether their bell is right on that rhythm. So as you start off ringing in rounds, you will be listening to that rhythm, and you'll be pulling your bell where you think, and then you need to adjust where you pull to get your bell in the right place. So that, and you do that regardless of whether it's your bell that's quick or slow or odd struck or the one that you're following. So what you're doing is you're actually working out how you need to pull. And if you find that you don't need to adjust and the person that you're following needs to adjust, then actually it's probably then that their bell that's odd struck and not yours. But then leading on to your, I think this is leading on to your second question of if there's an odd struck bell in the ringing and it's not you, it's not the one you're following, what do you do? Well, what you do is, having worked out how quickly and how slowly you need to pull your hand stroke and backstroke to be in the right place, you keep doing that regardless of which bell you're following. If you try to work out what the gap is that you need to put between the pull of the bell you're following and you for every bell, then in rounds, or if you're ringing chord changes on 6 bells, then you need to work that out for 5 other bells. But you also need to work it out for hand stroke and backstroke. So that's 10 different intervals you need to remember. As soon as you get into change ringing, where you get ringing quickly and slowly, that then multiplies by 3. So on 6 bells, you've got 30 different speeds to worry about. It's too much, you can't do it. So what you need to do is think about how you need to pull your own bell to get it in the right place. And that's where you move from relying on looking at the other ropes to ringing to a rhythm. So I would say that it's ringing to the rhythm first. It's listening for the correction second, and then the interval, using your eyes for that interval, will come third. So John Dodd up at Abridge, when we take the young ringers up there, he does say to them quite regularly, he says, it's pull, listen, look, in that order. And I actually think that's a really good message. So pull to a rhythm, listen to correct, and then look to see where you are. And I think then that will, that sort of principle addresses your third question as well, of what do you do when you get into changes. So the underlying message is move away from relying on your eyes. Try to rely on your rhythm a lot more, and try to use your ears a lot more.
Good. Thank you.
Does that address it, Steve?
Absolutely spot on. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I think